talk a little bit about where we stand with the U.S. economy and even a little bit about the global economy. Um, you may have noticed January was a bumpy month. The stock markets declined, and a lot of that had to do with the changing economic position that the United States is entering, which is we are going from being accommodative as far as the federal government was being stimulative in the fiscal stimuluses they had passed, the Federal Reserve, which sets interest rates for banks in the country. They were also they had set interest rates nearly to zero to try to stimulate growth through the pandemic. And what's recently happened is the signals have changed, where the United States government has ended a lot of the temporary fiscal programs like the home assistance, some of the child care tax credits. So some of the spending has pared back, while at the same time, the Federal Reserve has signaled that they're going to be hiking rates. And I'd like to pause for a moment and get a little bit further into the Federal Reserve and why they're hiking rates. One of the big topics of the economy right now is inflation. I'm sure you've all noticed when you go to the gas pumps, it's more than it was 6 months ago, a year ago. Price of oil over the past couple of years at one point was below $20 a barrel, and now is reaching towards $90 a barrel. So it's really been a big whipsaw for oil prices, and that's just one example of some of the numbers feeding into inflation. And the Federal Reserve, their job is to keep inflation low and to have full employment. And since we're more or less at full employment, unemployment rate is around 3.9%. So they kind of figure they have that box more or less checked off. And now that inflation is running hot, now now their job is to slow it down a little bit. So they are going to begin raising interest rates in an effort to slow down the economy. So right now, like I said, rates are set to around zero, and it's looking like they're going to raise rates at least 3 to 4 times this year. Now that can always change. They usually raise interest rates in quarterly increments. So all that being said, that's kind of where the economy stands. But I'll, as we go through the report, I'll relate some of that to your different investments. But I'll note these two things. The first is the stock market usually continues to go up during rate hike cycles. So just because the Federal Reserve is starting to slow down the economy, they usually do it in a very measured pace over time, and stocks continue to go up during those periods. So the most recent example is starting in 2015 through 2019, the Federal Reserve was raising rates, and that was still a very good time to be invested. And then the second thing I'll say is during January, I mentioned that we had this stock market downturn. I think at one point the S&P was down almost 10%, and then it's kind of recovered a little bit over the past week or two. So a 10% drop in the stock market is normal. It's a normal part of investing, and the frequency with which it occurs is actually almost every year we average at least a 10 to 15% decline throughout the year, and then usually it'll recover, and the year will end up positive. But from it's very common over a 1 year span to have a decline of at least 10%. It's just sometimes especially kind of since March of 2020, it just seems the market have only been able to go up. So it was a little jarring to see this volatility in January, but it is par for the course in a normal investing market. So if you'll go to the next page, please. So what I like about this page is it shows some of the activity throughout 2021. I know there's quite a few numbers, but so if you're looking at the top part of the screen, at the very top, you can see it's broken down into the different quarters. So what I want to highlight on this page is that in Q1 of 2021, so at the start of the year, the equity in the account was about 46.2%. And then I kind of mentioned how the stock market went up last year. That affected the equity proportion of your account. The stocks were growing in this account. And you can see they dropped in Q3 to 36.6%. That was because that's when we rebalanced. So what we'll normally do is, to keep within the target and desired ranges of your investment policy statement, when the stocks outgrow kind of a healthy position, then we'll trim them to get them more in line with your baseline allocation. So that's what we did in September of last year. So that's a good thing to take gains off the table when stocks have done well. Okay, so and I'll just point out, in this particular case, we sold out of a mix of the individual stocks that you had. We didn't, pick on, one stock here or there. We sold a bit out of most of them. Okay, Lori, if you could go to page 6. I'm sorry, it might be page 8 because of the cover page and the table of contents. Yeah, that was it right there, page 8. So this is a page I wanted to touch on that just shows the stock market allocation by their different sectors. So, and this reflects your actual holdings. You can see the beginning of your stocks listed individually below this chart. But I just like this top chart, because it shows the different sectors and the percentage that your account is in those respective sectors. The percentages are on the right-hand side of the chart. So the bar that sticks out the most is information technology. So that's, let's say 28% of your stocks. And it might look like a lot when it jumps out versus the other sectors. But this is a pretty close reflection of the actual stock market. So while we'll make small bets here or there, maybe we'll have 1 or 2% more in a sector than the U.S. market will have. That's about it. So we don't have a lot of differences with the U.S. stock market. So that just goes to show that information technology is by far the biggest sector in the U.S. economy now. The one area, so there's 11 sectors. You can see 10 here. The one that we're currently not invested in is energy. So that's it's only about 2.5% of the U.S. market. We're currently At the time of 12/31, when this report was ran, we were not invested in it. We have since added a little bit, um, and we can talk about that um, in more detail if you'd like. But I think it has to do with the reason we didn't have any energy is over the last several years, energy has not done very well, and the long-term prospects of it are very murky. So, but right now, while oil prices are good and energy companies have started to make a lot more money, we recently did add, like I said, a little bit to energy. Before I get into the fixed income part of the investment portfolio, I wanted to pause here to see if there are any questions. If there are any questions about stocks or the economy. Um, I'm sorry, if there's a question, I can't hear it.
There were no questions.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's your
Um,
microphone.
okay. So Lori, can you please go to page 12? So now we're going to talk about the fixed income part.
Nope, we lost you.
The most talked about part, and that's kind of why we go over those first. But like I said, bonds are where most of your investments are. So these are the bond funds that we currently own. And before we get into them, the one thing I wanted to talk briefly about was the state of interest rates. And I mentioned how the Federal Reserve is probably going to be hiking rates. So the what's regarded as kind of the benchmark interest rate in the economy is the 10-year U.S. Treasury, and right now that's about 1.8% is the yield on that, which is pretty low from a historical perspective. So if the Federal Reserve starts hiking rates, that 10-year rate is probably going to also go up, and that'll probably influence mortgage rates, car loans, credit card floating rates, things like that. So those are some of the ways that we can expect, to see those Federal Reserve rate hikes filter through to the economy and begin slowing things down and hopefully tame inflation a little bit. So the downside to investors is that if you're a bond investor like you folks are, when rates go up, that can hurt or decrease bond values a little bit. It kind of depends how fast rates go up, and it kind of depends also on the type of bonds you have. But in your case, with I can get however deep into these weeds you want, but we keep your exposure to interest rates less than the benchmark. So what that means is your benchmark, if they have an exposure, if they have an exposure to interest rates of a certain amount, yours is slightly less than that, and that's mostly because we structure your bonds to have slightly lower maturities than the benchmark. The longer the maturity of a bond, or the more it's going to be affected by rate hikes. So here are your bond funds, and these are a mix of government securities. So I should take that back. So they're mutual funds, but within the mutual funds own a mix of government securities. So in some instances it might be all government securities, but like the Fidelity U.S. Bond Fund also has some mortgage securities. Ginnie Mae's, Fannie Mae's, and it has some corporate bonds too. So what I'm getting at is your bonds are diversified. And then if we go down to the next slide. Thank you. So we also have here some individual bonds. So we own some of those bond funds on your behalf, and then we also own these individual funds. These individual securities. And you can see the maturity dates all are within 2 to 3 years. So that means that these would be considered short securities. So the average might be, 7, 8 years of maturity of a bond. So this is what I was getting at when I said you're positioned to be less exposed to those rate hikes I was talking about. Okay. Why don't I pause here for if there's any other questions, and then we're gonna jump to a little bit more about the performance next. But I just want to stop here and see if there's any questions about anything in the bond world.
I have a quick one. Can you just go, this is Chris Blackstone. Can you just go back and fill in the blank again? You said the longer the maturity of the bond, the what?
Yeah, the more it's going to be affected negatively by interest rate going up. So the reason is if you have a bond that is has 10 years to go till it matures, that means that you're gonna have to hold it longer. So what happens is if let's say I mentioned that the 10-year treasury was 1.8%. Well, if you buy a 10-year treasury today, you'll be getting 1.8%. But if the Federal Reserve hikes rates, and let's say they go to 2.8%, well, everyone who owns a bond that gives 1.8%, it's not going to be as good as the new 2.8% bonds. So those are going to become less valuable because everyone's going to want the 2.8%, and less people are going to want the 1.8%. So all I was getting at is because if it's a 10-year bond, it has more exposure to that because you have it for 10 years versus a 2-year bond. You only have it for 2 years, so you can wait 2 years and buy the new bond. Whereas the 10-year bond, you have to wait 10 years before you buy a new bond.
Thank you. That was clear. Thank you.
Sure. And thank you for asking a question. I love questions. Okay, so Lori, if you could please go to let's see here, page 16 in the presentation in the PDF file, but I think it's page 14 for those of you folks following along with the paper copy. So this is where we compare where we compare all of your investments to different benchmarks, and there's different time periods. So I know there's a lot of numbers on these pages, but I'll highlight the year-to-date column, and then we'll chat about the last 5 years, because really in investing, if you're sticking to your investment policy, the longer term periods are what matter most, especially for an organization like yours. It's great to have a good quarter, or or a good month or whatever, but when your account and your investments it should exist for perpetuity to help your organization. The longer term periods should really kind of be what's most important. But we'll talk about. So I mentioned that this past year was pretty good. You can see your account did 10.2%, and the benchmark was 8.8%. And then if you want to see, well, why did it do good? You can see. So the bonds actually had a negative year, negative 1.3, but they still beat the benchmark, which was negative 1.5. And that had to do with what I mentioned, where rates went up last year, because towards the end of the year, as investors started to figure out, hey, they're going to start hiking rates in these coming years. So the market kind of reacted to that early. And in other words, so rates went up, so bond values went down. But because your account is less exposed than the rest of the market, it didn't hurt you as bad, but it was still negative. But that also shows why it's so important to have a diversified portfolio like you folks have, is that stock's more than made up for it. Your stock portfolio returned 30.9%. And I mentioned earlier, the market was up almost 30%. So you can see 28.7. So the stock portfolio beat the market. And then the mid cap, I think is just an index, so it matched the market. And then international, you don't have as much invested in that. Most of the stocks are in the U.S., but so international was down a little bit. But overall, so last year was quite good for your account. Over the last 5 years, the return has been 8% versus 8.7%. Part of that is because the IPS keeps a very high proportion to cash. So because we keep in this account, the IPS has 5 to 10% in cash. So that is always going to be a little bit of a drag on returns versus if it were to be invested. But the flip side is it always gives you liquidity. So, you always have cash if you need it. So it just so happens that last year the stocks did so well and the bonds outperformed the benchmark that it more than made up for the cash. But I think over long periods of time, you'll see in your fixed income 2.8% versus 3.6%. That's something we could talk more about, but that's kind of another reason why the longer term has been a little bit below the benchmark. But all in all, the investments have done well. They've grown, and I think that covers the highlights of what I wanted to touch upon in the realm of performance. So, I think I chatted quite a bit. I'll stop here and see if there's any questions on performance or anything else. I hope my pacing was okay. But if you had any questions about things earlier in the report, feel free to ask. So I'll open it up to any questions.
This is Chris again. I would be curious if
Yeah.
in just not necessarily Newmarket, but just in your perspective and in your orbit, what are you seeing with the various healthcare companies and healthcare representations here?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially after the last couple of years that we've been through. So in general, healthcare is a pretty well-liked sector. If so, what might be helpful is, Laurie, if you could go back to um, page 8. So, or actually, why don't we go one page prior to this? Might be a little bit better. So about 13% of, or it's actually 13.7% if you go to the end of the Q4 of your account is in healthcare. And one of the reasons why it's one of the sectors that's most invested in, and what we like about healthcare and what we're seeing is that, so you have the baby boomers, which are retiring, and they are going, that's going to be a lot of, that's going to be, should be beneficial to healthcare companies, whether that's some of the, so not only insurance providers like that are getting onto Medicare and different forms of Medicare supplement insurance like United Healthcare and things like that, but also a lot of the device makers. So baby boomers have been a really active generation, and it'll probably continue to be that way into retirement. I know my father just, he's in his mid to late 70s, but he just got a knee replacement a month or two ago. But there's going to be a lot of knee and hip replacements, so devices are doing really well. And then on the pharmaceutical side, despite the ongoing talks about trying to lower prescription drug costs and different healthcare systems that or different healthcare system changes that could potentially happen here in the States, they continue to make a lot of money. I just saw just last week, the average prescription went up 6.6% over the past year. So, and then we saw how well, a lot of the vaccine makers have been pretty profitable, selling a lot of the COVID vaccines to, other countries around the world, to governments around the world. And a lot of those companies have stocks that trade in the U.S. Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. So I think health, when I talked earlier about energy and how the next 10 or 20 years might be a little murky, I think healthcare, it looks more positive. It looks more upside when you look at the next 10 or 20 years. So I would say that in this account, healthcare is going to remain one of the biggest investment sectors that we have.
Thank you, Corey.
Do you have it? And I'm just I'm always curious too. Is that do you agree with some of what I said, or did that surprise you? Do you disagree?
No, I could just say I beat your dad by an extra knee here, so I contributed to this by 2 devices.
Okay. And if you don't mind me asking, have you been able to be pretty active? My dad's still recovering, but he's hoping he can get back to riding bikes soon.
I would give him all the encouragement in the world, because whatever used to hurt him is not in his body anymore. So every day now he's healing from surgery, not wincing from pain from the nasty knee and
Yeah.
cartilage and whatnot. So I
That's a
would
good
give that a
point.
yes. I never ran races, so I can't say my time has improved, but I can say it's really fun to be able to do anything I want to without having that kind of pain.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions or anything that they'd like to add? Okay. So I think I'll thank you again for your time, and just to close out the meeting, the one thing I point out is that it might be worthwhile for our next meeting to revisit the investment policy statement. I know that Dino had taken a look at it, I believe in 2018. And I think your group had come pretty close to finalizing the changes. But it might be, even if we did decide not to make any changes, it might still be worth reviewing it at our next meeting, just because the last one signed copy on file we have is from 2010. So it might be worth just reviewing it. That's my only suggestion. So we'll do that at the next meeting if you agree.
Good idea.
Okay. So with that, I don't know if Lori, if you have anything to add. I think you might still be muted, but
I should call her on the phone and say we can't
Okay.
hear you.
yeah, I think she's laughing about it because she can tell. All right, we'll just we'll wish you a good evening, and we'll talk soon. So thanks again for the meeting tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corey, and all the
care.
best here in your new position. After your training, you're launching off into something great for you, I hope.
Thank you.